Before she became a punishment, she was a person shaped by ordinary mornings and fragile hopes. Her life had never intersected with power in any meaningful way, except through its absence. She grew up in a world where survival was a quiet skill learned early, how to stay unnoticed, how to endure, how to accept that safety was temporary and justice was selective. The streets taught her restraint. The system taught her nothing at all. In the Underworld's logic, this made her ideal. Criminal organizations do not choose symbols at random. They choose those who can be taken without resistance, whose disappearance will not provoke investigations or headlines. Race, gender, and poverty form an unspoken hierarchy of vulnerability, and she stood at its lowest rung, not because she lacked value, but because society had already decided her life could be discounted. Those who orchestrated her transfer never learned her story. They did not need to. Her background was irrelevant to her function. She was not being punished for something she had done, but for what someone else had failed to do. In this system, accountability flows downward, never upward. To the men who discussed her fate in low voices, she represented efficiency, a living reminder that mistakes carried consequences beyond the individual. By turning a human being into a message, the syndicate reinforced obedience without firing a single shot. But there was a risk in reducing a person to an object. Objects can be mishandled. As she waited inside the estate, time stretched unnaturally. There were no restraints, no immediate violence, no shouted orders. This absence confused her more than brutality would have. Fear thrives on patterns, and there was no pattern here, only silence and the heavy weight of expectation pressing down on her chest. She tried to remember her own name, not because she thought it would save her, but because remembering felt like resistance. In moments of extreme powerlessness, identity becomes the last possession a person can protect. Every breath became deliberate, every sound carried meaning. Around her, the men avoided proximity. This was not cruelty, it was superstition. In their minds, proximity implied complicity. If they did not touch her, speak to her, or acknowledge her existence, they could later claim innocence, not legally, but psychologically. This is how systems of violence protect their participants from themselves. What none of them considered was that the very act of dehumanization had already introduced instability. By assuming the boss would behave exactly as his reputation suggested, they surrendered independent judgment. They forgot that power does not eliminate choice, it amplifies it. And choice is unpredictable. She had been delivered as a warning, but warnings only function if they follow expectation. The longer nothing happened, the more the air thickened with doubt. A punishment delayed is not mercy, it is suspense, and suspense unsettles even the cruel. Somewhere deeper inside the house, the boss was being informed. Names, numbers, explanations, all delivered with practiced neutrality. To the messengers, this was routine. To her, it was the narrowing of a future she could no longer imagine. Yet in that narrowing space, something unexpected occurred. The story she had been assigned, victim, sacrifice, example, had not yet been accepted by the one person who mattered, and until it was accepted, it remained incomplete. She had been reduced to a message. But messages can be read differently. And in the Underworld, misinterpretation is often more dangerous than defiance. In the Underworld, punishment is never announced. It arrives quietly, like a shadow slipping under a closed door. No witnesses, no explanations, just an understanding that someone somewhere crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In this world, fear is not enforced through noise or spectacle, but through silence, because silence leaves room for imagination, and imagination is always more terrifying than truth. The girl's name was never written down. In the records of the syndicate, she existed only as a consequence. A debt, a correction. When a mid-level operator failed, not through betrayal but through weakness, the punishment demanded by the system was not his life. That would have been too simple. Instead, the message had to be permanent, personal, unforgettable. So the punishment was transferred. She was taken not because of who she was, but because of how easily she could be erased. A young black girl, invisible to the machinery of power, already living on the margins where disappearance rarely raises questions. In the language of the Underworld, she was not a person. She was leverage. No trial was held, no vote was taken. The decision passed through the hierarchy like a cold breath. She would be delivered to the boss, the man whose name was spoken only in lowered voices, whose presence was rumored rather than confirmed. A man whose reputation did not need embellishment because the truth was already worse than fiction. Those who arranged the transfer avoided eye contact, not out of guilt but out of instinct. In this world, sympathy is dangerous, it makes you visible, and visibility is how you die. The journey itself was part of the punishment. Long stretches of road, windows that did not open, men who never spoke to her, because speaking would require acknowledging that she could hear, understand, remember. To them, she was already gone, a body in motion, but a life already concluded. Stories circulated among the drivers, not told directly, but implied, of others who had been given before, of screams that never reached the street, of rooms that were cleaned with industrial bleach and never mentioned again. The mythology of cruelty was carefully maintained because it kept everyone obedient. By the time they reached the estate, fear had fully replaced time. The property itself was hidden behind layers of security, not to keep people out, but to ensure no one ever left with a story. The gates closed behind them with a sound that felt final. Inside, the men straightened their jackets. This was not respect, it was survival. Even seasoned criminals felt small here. The boss did not need to raise his voice. His authority existed in anticipation, in what everyone assumed he would do. The girl was led forward and told to wait. No explanation, no threats, just waiting. Waiting is the most refined form of terror because it forces the mind to create its own ending. Everyone knew what this was supposed to be: a demonstration, a reminder, a ritualized destruction designed to restore balance in a broken hierarchy. The boss had been insulted, and the system demanded blood, suffering, or both. Yet something about the stillness felt wrong. Minutes passed, then more. No orders were shouted, no doors slammed. The house remained quiet, too quiet for a place built on violence. Those present exchanged glances they would later deny, because in the underworld, uncertainty is more dangerous than brutality. The punishment had been delivered, but it had not yet been carried out. And in that pause, in that unexpected silence, the story began to fracture. Because what happened next was not part of the code. And once the code breaks, nothing is safe anymore. Reputation is the most carefully cultivated weapon in organized crime. It is built slowly, reinforced through rumor, and protected by selective truth. The boss at the center of this story understood that better than anyone. Long before people knew his face, they knew the outcomes associated with his name. Deals never renegotiated, disrespect never forgiven, silence always permanent. He had not risen through chaos, but through discipline. Violence, when he used it, was never impulsive. It was calculated, purposeful, and rare enough to remain legendary. That rarity made it terrifying. In criminal ecosystems, unpredictability is weakness, consistency is dominance, and he was nothing if not consistent. Those who worked under him believed they understood him. They believed his moral universe was simple: loyalty rewarded, failure punished, mercy interpreted as decay. This belief allowed them to function without questioning orders. They told themselves that the boss was not a man, but a principle, a living embodiment of the code. But principles do not think, men do. Inside the estate, away from the eyes of subordinates, the boss listened as the situation was explained. The failure, the insult, the proposed correction, the delivery of the girl as restitution. Each detail was presented as fact, stripped of emotion, framed as inevitability. This was how messengers survived, by making decisions sound preordained. The boss said nothing at first. Silence in his presence was not empty, it was evaluative. Those who had seen it before knew that this was when outcomes were decided, not announced. What none of them could measure was the weight of accumulated memory. Years of power do not erase reflection, they intensify it. Every violent decision leaves residue. Not guilt, necessarily, but awareness. An understanding of how fragile authority truly is, and how easily it collapses when it becomes mechanical. The girl was not the first human being offered to him as compensation, but she was different in ways that unsettled patterns he relied on, not because of sentiment, but because of symbolism. She represented nothing he had personally ordered, yet everything he was expected to authorize. Power at its highest level stops being about control and starts being about authorship. The boss understood that whatever happened next would not be attributed to the men who delivered her, or the man who failed him. It would be attributed to him alone. He reviewed the logic being presented. An example must be made, fear must be restored, balance must be reasserted. This was the language of systems protecting themselves, but systems do not bear consequences, individuals do. For the first time in years, the boss hesitated, not visibly, not theatrically, but internally. The pause was imperceptible to others, yet decisive. He recognized that if he proceeded as expected, the story would end exactly where everyone assumed it would: efficient, forgettable, reinforcing a mythology he no longer fully trusted. He requested to see her. The request disrupted the rhythm of the house. This was unusual. He did not need to see consequences to authorize them. Seeing implied evaluation. Evaluation implied uncertainty. When she was brought closer, he observed without interrogation. He did not ask her name. Names create relationships. Instead, he watched posture, breath, stillness. Fear, when unmasked, is revealing. It shows not only terror but intelligence, the ability to understand danger. What he saw did not absolve her, but it complicated the narrative. In that moment, the boss realized something his subordinates never could. The code had taught them how to punish, but not how to decide when punishment had become meaningless. If power is always predictable, it becomes replaceable. And if authority never surprises, it eventually collapses under its own repetition. The men waiting outside believed the outcome was sealed. They mistook calm for confirmation. They did not yet understand that the most dangerous decisions are not driven by anger, but by clarity. And clarity was beginning to shift the direction of the story. In worlds governed by violence, moments are supposed to follow rules. A punishment has a shape, a rhythm, a conclusion that everyone recognizes even before it arrives. The men inside the estate waited for that familiar sequence, an order, movement, sound, something that would confirm the universe was still functioning as designed. But the moment refused to arrive. The girl stood where she had been placed, suspended between expectation and reality. No one touched her, no one spoke. The air felt heavier, not because of threat, but because of delay. In criminal culture, delay is unsettling. It suggests that something has gone wrong, not with the victim, but with the decision itself. Inside the inner room, the boss remained seated. He did not raise his voice. He did not summon violence. Instead, he allowed silence to expand, pressing against the walls, creeping into the corridors, forcing everyone nearby to confront their own assumptions. This was the moment that should have ended quickly. Instead, it stretched. Those closest to power felt unease first. They had built their lives around anticipating his reactions. Anticipation was safety. Yet now, anticipation failed them. The boss was not performing the role they had written for him. And when a figure of authority steps outside expectation, the system that depends on him begins to shake. The girl noticed the shift before anyone acknowledged it. Fear sharpens perception. She sensed that whatever was happening was not meant to include her voice, yet her presence had disrupted something fundamental. She was no longer just an object awaiting use. She had become a variable. The boss stood and approached her slowly. This alone broke protocol. He was not supposed to close distance. Distance was part of his power. By crossing the room himself, he altered the geometry of authority. He did not threaten her, he did not touch her. He asked a single, quiet question, not about guilt, not about loyalty, but about time. How long had she been waiting? It was an insignificant question in appearance. In context, it was revolutionary. Time acknowledges existence. It recognizes that someone experiences duration, anticipation, fear. By asking it, the boss implicitly rejected the framing that had brought her there. Those listening understood immediately. Something irreversible had just occurred. The moment that did not happen, the violence everyone expected, was replaced by something far more destabilizing. Choice, not mercy yet, not justice, just choice. In criminal hierarchies, choice is dangerous because it introduces responsibility. If the boss chose differently, then every past decision could be re-examined, every future punishment questioned. The myth of inevitability would collapse. He turned away without issuing an order. That absence of instruction echoed louder than gunfire. The men exchanged glances they would later deny. They had prepared themselves to witness brutality. They were not prepared to witness restraint. Restraint required interpretation. Interpretation required thought. And thought, in violent systems, is a liability. The girl remained standing, unsure whether to move, breathe, or speak. Survival had taught her not to assume safety prematurely, but even she understood that the script had been abandoned. The moment had passed. Nothing had happened. And because nothing happened, everything changed. The Underworld survives on repetition. Every action reinforces what came before it, creating a closed loop where power validates itself through predictability. That night, the loop broke. The boss did not issue an order for punishment. He issued an instruction that no one had prepared for. He told them to remove her from the room. At first, the words did not register. Men trained for violence often struggle with instructions that do not involve it. Removal implied preservation. Preservation implied intention. And intention implied that what followed would not serve the original purpose. She was escorted away, not dragged, not rushed, but guided, as if the environment itself had lost certainty. The corridors felt different now, not safer, unstable. When systems built on fear hesitate, even their strongest structures feel fragile. The boss remained behind, alone with the weight of what he had just disrupted. He understood the implications better than anyone else. This was not mercy disguised as kindness, it was strategy sharpened by conscience. He had chosen to reject the symbolic function assigned to the girl and replace it with something far more dangerous, meaning. Later, he summoned his inner circle. He did not justify his decision emotionally. He did not explain it as compassion. That would have been fatal. Instead, he reframed the entire event as correction of inefficiency. The punishment, he said, had been misdirected. Fear applied randomly weakens authority. Fear applied without reason creates chaos, and chaos invites challenges. By refusing to harm her, he reclaimed authorship over the narrative. But that was only the beginning. He ordered that she be given protection, education, and resources, not secretly, but openly. Visibility was the point. Everyone needed to know that this outcome was intentional, that it originated from him, that it could not be dismissed as weakness or sentimentality. This decision fractured the psychological contract that bound his organization together. Some saw it as evolution, others saw it as decay, all of them saw it as dangerous. For the girl, the shift was incomprehensible. Survival instincts do not recalibrate quickly. Every kindness felt provisional. Every door opened seemed designed to close again. Yet days passed, then weeks, and nothing was taken from her in return. The boss never positioned himself as a savior. He did not seek gratitude. That too would have distorted the power dynamic. Instead, he treated her existence as a fixed fact, one that no longer required justification. What unsettled the Underworld was not that he spared her. It was that he transformed a punishment into a precedent. Precedents spread quietly. They linger in memory. They inspire imitation or rebellion. By choosing restraint, the boss forced everyone beneath him to confront an uncomfortable question. If violence was optional here, where else might it be unnecessary? That question destabilized more than bullets ever could. Alliances grew tense. Whispers circulated. Loyalty, once automatic, became conditional. The boss had not weakened himself, he had exposed the fragility of the system itself. And systems do not forgive exposure. The girl had been delivered as an ending. Instead, she became the beginning of something no one could control. No system built on fear survives its first moral contradiction. It only pretends to. The decision that spared the girl did not explode outward immediately. It moved slowly, like a pressure change deep underwater, imperceptible at first but inevitable in its damage. In the weeks that followed, nothing appeared different on the surface. Deals were made, orders were obeyed, money flowed as it always had. But underneath, the equilibrium was gone. Men who had once relied on certainty now hesitated. Punishment had always been the anchor of obedience, the guarantee that failure would be met with predictable consequences. That predictability had vanished. The boss had proven that outcomes were no longer automatic, that discretion had replaced ritual. For some, this was liberating. For others, it was terrifying. Powerful figures within the organization began to reassess loyalties, not because the boss had become weak, but because he had become unpredictable in a new way. Violence was no longer the sole language of authority, and when a language evolves, those fluent only in the old dialect find themselves obsolete. Whispers grew louder, challenges more subtle. Efficiency declined. Fear, once clean and directional, became scattered. The girl was no longer at the center of discussions, yet she haunted them all. She existed as living proof that the code was not absolute, that the system's cruelty was a choice, not a law of nature. Her survival forced a realization that many could not tolerate. Some left, some plotted, some waited. The boss understood what was coming long before it arrived. He had not acted out of naivete. He knew that by introducing humanity into a machine designed to erase it, he had set a timer. Systems do not adapt easily. They fracture, then rebuild, often violently. What mattered to him was that the fracture had been his. For the girl, the consequences were quieter but no less profound. She disappeared from the Underworld's conversations, not because she had been forgotten, but because remembering her required confronting uncomfortable truths. She rebuilt an identity that had nearly been erased, slowly, cautiously, without spectacle. She was never used again as a message. That alone altered the balance. Years later, analysts would debate the moment endlessly. Some would argue that the boss's decision marked the beginning of his decline. Others would say it was the most powerful act of leadership he ever demonstrated. Both interpretations missed the point. The real shock was not what he did for her. It was what he did to the myth. By refusing to complete the punishment, he exposed the machinery behind cruelty. He showed that even in the darkest hierarchies, brutality survives not because it is inevitable, but because it is repeated without question. That night, one question was asked. And once asked, it could never be unasked.